I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. This is a podcast episode brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Welcome back to Matan's Parsha podcast. This series on Shemot explores personalities, 19th and 20th century commentators, and how their commentaries are informed and shaped by the worlds in which they lived. Today's episode is dedicated by Sara Averick and Jose Rosenfeld in honor of their children. They honor and thank Batya and Nehemiah Rosenfeld, who are teaching and inspiring the Jewish communities of Nashville, Tennessee, and honor and thank their sons-in-laws Malachi, Ezra, and Yotam, who have been mobilized in Simchat Torah, and their daughters Elisheva, Vital, and Yehudit, who have been sustaining their families on the home front. Praying for the immediate return of all the hostages and the missing, and that our soldiers and security forces complete their missions and return to us whole in body and soul. Thank you for your generosity. Parshat Bo opens with the final three plagues, locusts, darkness, and the death of the firstborn, and includes all of the formative instructions for the moments of Exodus, the Pesach sacrifice, the redemption of the animal and human firstborn, and how this mitzvah intertwines with the plague of the firstborn. The Parsha is unusually occupied with setting the tone for how Pesach will be remembered in the future. It spends far less time recording the events as they happened in Pesach Mitzrayim, and much more detailing how they should be commemorated in the future for Pesach L'Dorot. One senses that the Parsha is quite self-aware regarding how formative these events will be for the current and particularly for the future generations. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Rashat Beit Midrash of Matan and its academic director, Dr. Yael Ziegler, the author of multiple Tanakh commentaries. Yael is also a senior lecturer at Herzog College. Yael, it's a pleasure to have you back here.
Hi, Yosefa. It's a pleasure to be back.
So we are going to take a little bit of a twist on the theme of the stated theme of this series. And Yael and I actually wanted to speak about a particular personality within the Parsha because this opportunity really won't return. And that's the personality of Paro himself, of the king, the Pharaoh of Mitzrayim. So Yael, why don't we sort of jump into this idea of what the name Paro means and why is he called that in this series of stories and events?
Okay, so he's actually referred to in two ways in the story. He's referred to as Melech Mitzrayim. Okay, so he's the king of Egypt. And he's also referred to as the Pharaoh. Paro is not a proper name, right? Something that we think when we're little kids, we call him Paro. We think that's his proper name. But of course, Paro it's a reference to his position, right? It's a compound Egyptian word, par and o, which means great house. It's actually a reference to the palace. But at some point during the course of the history of ancient Egypt, it became a reference to the king himself. Like we might say, the White House says, right? And we know that we're not talking about a house speaking. We know that we're talking about the position of the presidency. So it's a similar kind of thing. Paro is a reference to his to the palace, but it's also a reference to the king. What's interesting in the Paro story is that even though the Tanakh almost always refers to him as Paro, I mean, Melech Mitzrayim only comes up maybe like 14 times, and the name Paro is well over 100 times within the story. So most of the time he's referenced as Paro, but he actually never gets a proper name, which is interesting because in other stories, especially later stories, Paro is going to be linked to his proper name. So we have Paro Shishak, or Paro Necho, or Tirhaka, and those Paros we can actually identify because we know a great deal about ancient Egyptian pharaohs. But one of the confounding parts of our story is that we can't actually date our story with any degree of certainty because we don't know the name of this Paro. And it seems as though really the Tanakh deliberately erases his name, which if in fact this is a conscious attempt to erase Paro's name, that's a very significant thing to do.
We have this general question regarding, which is not our topic for today, but the historicity of the story of Exodus, right? So on one hand, while the name Paro is a name, it kind of keeps him anonymous. And in that regard, it brings me to this general question of what is the purpose of anonymity in Tanakh, meaning sometimes it represents the idea that this is an ongoing situation. It's certainly here not the case that he's not important, right? He's a particularly important guy. It may be perhaps suggesting that he's not as important as he thinks. I mean, he doesn't deserve a first name. And I think also it's maybe speaking to like the everlasting element of this story, of that this Paro, it doesn't matter which Paro he really was, because we're going to keep living the story of the Exodus for generations. I don't know if that's sort of, maybe those are just some ideas that come up as you speak about this lack of specific pronoun.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think all of those things are true. I also think that it doesn't really matter who this Paro is, because he's a representative of a certain kind of tyranny, a certain kind of despotism that is very much present in, I would say, pretty much all monarchical societies. It's certainly Egypt, which is really a society that is very much revolves around this one figure. I mean, Martin Buber famously described the hierarchy of Egyptian society as a pyramid, right, where the Paro is at the top, and all of the citizens of Egypt are under him, are these underlings that really live to serve him. But I think what's even more significant is what you said, which is that, you know, we often talk about the meaning and the idea behind anonymous characters in Tanakh. And certainly at the beginning of the Shemot story, we have a great deal of figures who are not named, right? Especially in the story of Moshe's birth, right? And it's particularly ironic in a book that starts out Ve'ele Shemot, right? These are the names. And so we have a book which starts out with names and very rapidly kind of spirals off into anonymity. And what we often talk about is that this is the condition of slavery, right? This is what happens when you enslave people and you take away their identity and you take away their purpose. But that only, I think, makes it more peculiar that this Paro doesn't have a name, because if there's anybody in this society who has a name, if there's one person in Egyptian society who should have a name or should retain their name, it would be Paro, and therefore I'm pretty convinced that this is a very deliberate attempt to erase this Paro, and I think that the idea is similar to what I think you were, the direction that you were going in, which is that there's this notion that this Paro, who has put himself at the helm of society and even deified himself, right, turned himself into a deity and puts great stock into his name, right? He's very, Paros are very interested in their name. They carve their name in these, in these kind of oval figures that the French archaeologists called a cartouche, right? And they would carve their name into them and oftentimes follow it with all sorts of hieroglyphics talking about how the king will be eternal and, and will live forever. And by erasing his name, there's this sense that we have erased his power, his identity, his impact, right? Who he is in the world. And the flip side, of course, is that throughout the Shemot story, we have the establishment of God's name, right? Already starting from the burning bush, right? Starting from Moshe's encounter with God, where he says to God, Moshe says to God, when the people say to me, Va'amruli ma shmo, what is his name? Ma omar lehem, right? What should I say to them? And so, and then God, introduces himself to Moshe, for Moshe to bring to the people, but also later in Parshat Ve'era, right? Ve'era el Avram el Yitzchak v'Yaakov be'el Shaddai u'shmi Hashem lo nodati lahem, right? I appeared to the forefathers with one name, but I never told them the Shem Havaya. I never told them my real name, right? And then he introduces himself over and over and over. Ani Hashem, Ani Hashem, Ani Hashem. And of course, in next week's parsha, at the denouement of the story, right, in Shirat Hayam, what the people proclaim, Hashem ish milchama, Hashem shmo, right? God is his name. So there's this kind of, I think, shift of perception that's going on here, where human beings, we're told, can carve their name into as many buildings as they want. But ultimately, their name, their reputation, their identity, their sense of self, it is, it's negligible compared to God's impact on the world. And of course, the whole story to some degree is casting doubts on the question as to whether or not a human being, can in any way function in any sort of powerful way without relying on God, right? So I think that the name is a very significant element here.
I think it reminds me of two things. One is very much that what we would call like the ancient polemic of calling them the Me'orota Hagdolim. We have the sun and the moon, but they don't get the name sun and moon because they were also worshipped in the ancient Near East. And so we have that similar idea here, right? Again, that Paro isn't going to get that name. We're going to emphasize the name of God here. I'll also just state one other thing, which I learned in preparation for this podcast. I'm not particularly holding in Egyptian cultural knowledge, but the idea that not only did the Paro have sort of 5 different names that he was referred to, as you said, and some of them were engraved in this cartouche, but he also was thought to have this role. Now, he wasn't the God, okay? That's not true, but he was thought to be the mediator, meaning he kept the world in balance. He was the mediator between, correct me if I'm wrong, because you know more about this, but he was the mediator between the gods and the people, which also just speaks to this like unbelievably strong focal point. And it's one article that I saw, it spoke about in the story of Paro and the story of Bereshit, when it came to Abraham, that things were off, and he realized that things were off, and he immediately had to give back this woman who he had taken accidentally, or again, without his knowing the full story, because he was in charge of keeping things in balance. He couldn't afford to let I don't know if it was the energy or whatever it was in Mitzrayim be off balance. And so it's like literally the opposite approach or sort of very, very different approach to what we have in our belief system, right? Of that there is no intermediary that is in charge of keeping the world in balance. That is solely the responsibility and the leadership of God. So I'm just sort of highlighting those additional points, and it really does throw me back to those earlier polemics, sort of that you can read in the beginning of Bereshit of, you know, you're not going to have a name because you get way too much power in the ancient world, and we want to make sure that we sort of bring you down a little bit.
Well, I'll add one more thing to that. I mean, I can't say that I fully understand Egyptian religion. I think it's extremely complex. And, you know, the Paro himself has some kind of deified status. But I will add one more point, and that is that many of the names of the pharaohs are theophoric, in that they're a compound name that is connected to a god's name. And oftentimes that theophoric name has a Moshe in it. Okay, so Ra Moses, Tut Moses, Ach Moses, and all of those are names of gods where Moshe means either to be born or, you know, the child of, right? So we have, you know, Ra is born in him, or Ra birthed him, right? You know, Tut is born in him. He becomes this kind of manifestation of a god. And of course, what's wonderful about that is that the greatest leader of Am Yisrael in all of Tanakh is born Moses, right? Moshe. He's born without any deified status, without any sort of, I don't know, biological link to a god. He's just born. He's just born. He's born a human being to human beings. He is a great human, and he achieves, I think, a very strong, perhaps the most amazing, the most magnificent relationship that we could imagine with God, right? You know, standing on Har Sinai, panim el panim, kasher yidaber ish el re'ehu. But a God, he is not, right? And I think that also is something that sort of is contrasts with what we know about the names of Paros, of Egyptian kings.
I maybe this is sort of to belabor a point that's obvious, but I guess something that I'm being inspired by at the moment from that point, and by the way, also Kasuto, I think he wasn't the first, but one of the first who said Moshe just means son, right? It's like calling your kid Ben. That's how he understands the name Moshe. But the ancient world, for many understandable reasons, underestimated the potential that human beings had. And so you only could be something that was special or worthy of mention if you if you were a god, right? If you were on some sort of elevated status. And one of the greatest revolutions that the Torah creates is by stating that everybody has Tzelem Elokim in them, meaning it's not some sort of special status. We also have some sort of internal hierarchy. That's for another conversation, maybe in Sefer Vayikra, but that every single person has that potential because we all have a piece of God in us. But on our own merit, we can also connect with God. And so it's just a totally different imagining of the relationship between the human and the divine, and that it's not that we have to elevate a human to be like a god, but that God actually puts himself in all of us, and that we then, as humans, imbued with that unique spirit, can then create a relationship with God.
I agree with you. I think one of the great chidushim of the Tanakh and of Judaism is what I would call gadlut ha'adam, the greatness of human beings. I think that Tzelem Elokim is saying to us very much what you said, which is that you don't have to turn into a god. There is this idea that human beings could become gods, could be demigods in all sorts of ancient cultures. And what the Torah is saying is, stay in your lane, right? You're human, and you could be great, and you could attain great spirituality with a lot of work, of course, right?
I just want to also add in there, Yael, that the promise that the Nachash says to Adam and Chava is V'item ke'Elohim, meaning that is of the most ancient desires, is that we will become greater than we are. But even if we read it even more literally here, that we will become like a god. And God very clearly says, no, right? You are not to do that. You are not to elevate yourself above that status. You are to remain as human.
I love that you just said that, because who is it that says V'yitem ke'Elohim? It's the Nachash who says it to Chava, and the Nachash is a symbol of Egypt. Right? I think that in the Gan Eden story, there's a lot of Egypt that is going on there. There's the Eitz Hadat, there's the Eitz HaChaim, there's the notion that we can somehow overcome our mortality and live forever, which is certainly something very, very, very prominent in Egyptian ancient thought. There's this idea that you can become a deity. And, of course, in general, I think that, that the Nachash is a negative symbol that becomes eventually the symbol of Egypt, right? I mean, not just because we throw down the staff, or, Moshe throws down the staff and it becomes a snake, but also in Yirmiyahu Perek Mem Vav, which I believe is the Haftarah for Parshat Bo, right? It says, Kola kanachash yelech, when we're talking about Egypt, right? Her voice goes moves like a snake, right? So the snake becomes a symbol of Egypt. So that's also, I think, a very strong point. I wanted to comment on something you said before, which is before you cited Kasuto talking about saying that Moshe means son. But since this Sefer's podcast is about 19th century personalities, so I would add that the Netziv, right, who already lives after a time that hieroglyphics have been deciphered and the knowledge is out there, the Netziv actually says, well, I know that in ancient Egyptian, Moshe means son, right? So he may be, I think, the first traditional, non-academic Jewish source that, I don't know if he's the first one to use ancient Egyptian, but he's the earliest one that I know about that actually introduces it into his Parshanut. And he specifically says it with regard to Moshe. So that's just, just to add in a little piece that can be connect to the theme.
So we've addressed the name of Paro, essentially why he doesn't have a name.
I want to make one final point about Paro. As we said, he is really, really the central figure in the Yetziat Mitzrayim story. So that in the first 15 chapters of Sefer Shemot, he appears well over 100 times, right? And he, the whole story kind of revolves around him, around his cruelty, his obstinance, his refusal to, and his deception also, his refusal to listen to God's messages, and his, always saying, okay, yeah, I'll do that, and then changing his mind, right? So Paro is really very much the dominant figure. But what's extraordinary is that after Perek Tetvav, he only appears again in Sefer Shemot when Yitro comes to visit Moshe at Har Elokim, And there he says, I'm so happy that God saved you, miyad Mitzrayim, miyad Paro, right? I'm so happy that God saved you from the hands of Paro. And there Paro appears 3 times in that chapter, and never again in the entire rest of the book of Shemot. So that 2/3 of the book of Shemot is basically completely absent of Paro. He just dissolves. He is no longer important. He was very, very important. He, overshadows the story, and then he's just erased. Now, of course, we mention him, in so many aspects of our yearly, yearly commemoration of the story. It's not as though we don't regard Paro as an important figure of our backdrop, right? But that's where he stays. He stays in our backdrop. V'kein yovdu kol oivecha Yisrael, meaning that's where, I would say similar about other enemies that we've had throughout the course of Jewish history. It's not that they don't remain as these figures that are part of the vile nature of human beings and what human beings can do to each other, but that ultimately their power fades. The obvious example being Hitler, right? Because he was, and he will always be, I think, a symbol of everything that's bad, everything that's evil. But he's gone, and gone in a very sweeping way. And the same thing we see with regard to Paro.
Yeah, I think that there's a reality there about people who place power as the overarching goal of their life, that once you don't have it, you no longer exist. I'm sorry to use a metaphor, but I know you'll appreciate it. It's a little bit like how in the stories of Harry Potter, Voldemort can't just die. He actually dissipates into thin air, meaning this is not just a theme. It's not a literary trope. It's this concept that when your entire life's goal is to rule over others, when you no longer possess that rule, you no longer exist because you've negated the other aspects of your humanity. So I think that there's a really, really deep point there that's laden in this sort of disappearance of the big Paro who we meet at the beginning and is so prominent.
Yeah.
So, Yael, why don't we talk a little bit about the way that Paro appears in the beginning of the stories? To me, he kind of a little bit, I get that we become really numerous and there may be something threatening about us, but we're the other. We're these non-native peoples. It's hard for me to really imagine that we were that big of a threat. But all of a sudden we get like this very paranoid Paro who's very nervous about the fact that we're going to sort of overtake him and join up with his enemies. So let's talk a little bit about that scene. There's something kind of puzzling about the way the whole story opens. And then we get into the slave room, we kind of forget about the opening piece. But where does that come from?
Yeah, it's what I think is really interesting about this piece is that it starts out before the king says, let's plot against these numerous Israelites. The pasuk tells us, "Asher lo yada et Yosef," right? Vayakam melech chadash al Mitzrayim, Asher lo yada et Yosef. This new king gets up over Egypt who didn't know Yosef. What does Yosef have to do with anything here? It's almost as though that gratitude towards Yosef, that kind of the fact that he owed Yosef, it's been gnawing away at Egypt for all these years. And as soon as he has the opportunity to turn his people against Yosef, so that we no longer have to have any gratitude towards this figure who saved Egypt, right? So as soon as he has the opportunity to pull away from Yosef and turn the people against him, it's almost as though this resentment has been stewing in Egypt for all these years. And Paro doesn't really have too much trouble convincing the people that Yosef is the other, and therefore Israel is the other. And by the end of the story, it's not even by the end of the story, as Parak Aleph goes on, all of Egypt is co-opted into this hatred, which seems to start from the original gratitude that they owed Yosef. It seems to start from all the good that Yosef did.
I will say that while time moves quickly in these chapters, I think, though, it is important to notice that just like another kind of solution that we know from modern history, there were a few stages in Paro's plan. Meaning, first, he tries to deal with, quote unquote, the issue by putting them into slavery. And then he tries to start killing them in a private kind of way, right? Get those midwives, sort of like a private op, only kill some of them. And then we see the continuation, right? The more intensifying of the work. There's also a very interesting play there, again, very similar to the concept of the Gestapo, where some of these police forces are clearly Jewish police forces. And so he starts employing our people against us. And then he calls for something that's much greater. So while time moves kind of quickly, there are multiple stages to the way that Paro tries to deal with us. And we're told in the Psukim, it's because the initial efforts didn't work, right? The more he tried to work us hard, the more we were resilient, right? And that's, again, something, unfortunately, that we're familiar with from the current reality, right? Push us to our edge and we'll discover that we have a new edge and that we can actually outperform what we did before. So there are a number of stages in his plan.
Right. Well, also, I think success breeds more resentment. The Ramban famously talks about these stages and basically explains that Paro was slowly but surely ensuring that the people would be on his side. You can't just stand up and say, okay, now I'm going to kill all these people. That there's an incremental kind of movement towards the ability to convince the Egyptians that these people who yesterday were their neighbors, and not only their neighbors, people who they had gratitude towards because they were helpful in society. So to convince them that in fact they're not helpful to society, but they're undermining society, that takes a certain kind of gradual, almost pre-planned kind of, Paro has a plan here, and the plan is slowly but surely to sow hatred and to continue to breed resentment so that he can co-opt his nation into turning Israel into the evil enemy. This, of course, I think to some degree echoes with many different experiences that Am Yisrael had throughout their history. And the other point that I think that is very famously made here is that Paro is the one that turns Israel into a nation, and that Israel becomes a nation on the backdrop of this hatred that surrounds them. I mean, that sounds very negative, but certainly we see that also in Megillat Esther, right? So then in Megillat Esther, the first 2 chapters of the Megillah, there's one Jew in Shushan, right? It's just Mordechai. Everybody else seems very much to have faded in the background until Haman comes along and says, Yeshno am echad mefuzar u'meforad bein ha'amim. There's this one nation out there. And suddenly he, through his hatred and through his evil policies, turns Am Yisrael, reminds Am Yisrael that they're a nation. And here I think this is really the beginning of nationhood. So I don't know, that might sound a little bit negative, but that certainly is part of the story here in Egypt.
I mean, it's negative, Yael, but it's the reality. Again, it's the exact reality that we're seeing now, is that we remember that we're all bound to each other when somebody decides that they want to hate us as a group. It's interesting also because it doesn't seem like in the world today people have to work very hard to sow the hatred. It sort of seems to be right there in the strings of the cloth. But I think that it's also reminding me, when we speak about this idea of that kind of hatred, which again, can we call it a paranoia? Do you think that there's a justification for Paro's concerns here?
Well, I mean, let's put it this way. Even if Paro doesn't believe it, what I think is remarkable is what people are willing to believe. The fact that Paro says to his people, he says, Hinei am bnei Israel rav atzum mimenu, right? That nation of Israel, they are greater and more powerful than us, which is, it's clearly hyperbolic, right? I mean, there's
yeah, it has to be, just numbers wise, it has to be.
Yeah, but the fact that he can convince his people that Am Yisrael is this encroaching threat, right? You ask any anti-Semite around the world, how many Jews are there, right? And they will grossly exaggerate the figures. And people are willing to believe all sorts of, I think, things that are presented to them when you have whipped them up into a state of resentment and hatred. And the hatred in this story largely seems predicated on the success of Am Yisrael, not just their fertility and their the fact that they're growing in number and the fact that they're very successful, but also what we said before about Yosef, that Yosef rises to great prominence and becomes a figure that Egypt depended on to really kind of lead them out of the famine, and all of this enables people to believe all sorts of exaggerated things that really shouldn't be so believable. But I don't want to forget, though, to say that there are always exceptional figures in a society, right? And we can't forget the midwives, and we can't forget Paro's own daughter, who acts against him on the basis of her own moral compunctions, right? And that, of course, becomes, I think, the spark of hope that enables Moshe to be born. Moshe couldn't be born without this. And that enables, I think, all societies to emerge from that kind of, maw of hatred and evil that societies can oftentimes spiral into. But these exceptional figures, they're part of Gadlut Adam. They're part of what's great about humans. The fact that some people can always emerge with good.
Yeah, so two thoughts. First, a negative one, and then I'll echo your positive one, which is that the negative aspect of Paro and his leadership is there's a very, very important Midrash. I teach it in the context of Megillat Esther. And the Midrash basically parallels some pretty negative figures. And it says, I'll just read a few lines of it. Amar Rabbi Levi, arorim hem reshaim shehem mitaskim be'etza ra'a Yisrael. Right? Cursed are those wicked people who are constantly engaged in trying to sort of create bad or do bad to Am Yisrael. And every one of them, yoetz lefi darko. Everybody has like their own idea of what they think is a good idea, how to get rid of us. It starts first with Esav says Cain was a shoteh. Cain was an ignoramus, right? He thought if he only kills one brother, so he'll be able to rule. But he forgets that his parents could have more children still. So he says, I'll try, right? I'll try and get rid of also my father and my brother. We'll leave that aside for now. And then it says Paro said, Esav was an idiot, essentially. He says, right, he thought that it would be enough just to kill members of his own family in order to be able to rule. And Paro says, Ma pitom, I have to kill all of the baby boys. And then Haman comes and says, right, Paro, my goodness, you missed the boat. How could you think that? How do you think if you only kill half the population? What do you mean? You'll have all the women there. I'll just say on the side of Paro that obviously Paro thought that the women would marry into Egyptian families, and so he wouldn't have to worry about them. But Haman says, no, I have to kill everybody, right? Lashmigva, larogu, labed, right? All of the entire people. And then it goes on to later the Gog Magog. But the point being that, every leader is sort of trying to outdo, right? You could put, Hitler right into that Midrash there, of course. So that Midrash is always, I think, very, very important because it reminds us to align these rulers with one another. It's not just like an evil. We have other negative figures in Tanakh, but these are figures who were looking to decimate, to kill, to eradicate in a way that was very different than just a regular, military threat that we had in many other stories of Tanakh. And the other piece that I just wanted to respond with, which is that when you speak about figures of hope in society, again, echoing obviously the Midrash as well, but there's a very clear statement here about men and women in this story without even the help of the Midrash, right? We have this idea that in a society that is lost in a world of tyranny and power, and again, they were the men that were in power then, and that would be true for many, 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 many more years even after the story, those who would be able to save the world with a degree of softness and a concept that every single human life is worth remaining in this world are the women in the story. And so while I think there are many aspects of why they're Nashim Tzidkaniyot, and Chazal are pointed to multiple models within the story, on a very basic level, it is the women who see the significance of life, and the men here who are willing to throw it out, Paro specifically, are willing to throw it out the window for the sake of their own power.
Well, I would relate that also to compassion, right? The word for compassion, rachamim, comes from the rechem, right? Those two words, the womb, those two words are etymologically related. And so this notion that, it doesn't mean that anybody who has a womb is compassionate, but it means that the notion that we bring life into the world and that we're looking towards the future It's what inspires all of humanity. It's what should inspire all of humanity to build a just and compassionate world. I came across a Midrash with regard to Amalek that I think is very relevant both in this discussion and maybe for some of the things that are happening today. This Midrash says, it pays attention to the fact that in all of the different battles with Amalek, whether we're talking about, with Yehoshua, or we're talking about with Shaul, or we're talking about with David in Shmuel Aleph Perek Lamed in Siklag, or we're talking about Megillat Esther with Haman Ha'agagi, the Midrash says all of these battles take place tomorrow. Vayhi mimochorat. Limachar e'aseh kidvar hamelech. Machar, machar, machar. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. And one of the things that I think that is extraordinary in this Midrash, and the Midrash doesn't spell it out, but I think that it seems to me to be the obvious idea, which is that the strength of Am Yisrael against Amalek is the belief in tomorrow. It's the notion that we have a tomorrow, that we're building a future for tomorrow, that we're building schools, and that we're building, institutions, and we're building a society that is designed to create a better tomorrow. And those societies, like Amalek, who don't invest in tomorrow, they are naturally going to be weak, and we're going to be able to triumph over those societies because we will fight them not tomorrow but for tomorrow. So at that point, I think it goes back to the women, which is that the women are more naturally inclined to be looking towards tomorrow. I just want to mention one more midrash, since we've been talking about a lot of midrashim that are relating to this this idea of what happens in an evil society and how these evil figures actually how they influence their constituents. So there's a really well-known midrash. It appears in several different places in rabbinic literature that when Paro was trying to decide what to do with Am Yisrael, he calls together his three great advisors, right? And they are Bil'am, Iyov, and Yitro, who are three, great non-Israelite figures, or generally regarded as non-Israelite figures in Tanakh. And the Midrash says, well, Bil'am was the one who said to Paro, yeah, let's kill them all, right? Yeah, genocide, that's the right way to go. And Iyov was silent, and that's why Iyov suffers, and Yitro gets up and leaves Egypt. He runs away. He wants no part in this. And I think this Midrash is really drawing for us the three different types of responses to evil, right? There are those who are gleeful and celebrating and handing out candy and going out and saying, wow, this is the greatest thing that we could do in society, is to create a society of evil. And then there are those who kind of close their door and put their heads under the covers and say, okay, but it has nothing to do with me. It's not, it doesn't affect my life. And then there are those who refuse to be part of it and protest and really come out against it. And that's a typology, right? That's a typology of three different ways of responding to evil. And the Midrash goes on and explains why each one at the end gets what's coming to them. But of course, a word about Yitro, which is that Yitro ultimately is incorporated within the vision of Judaism, right? Yitro sets up the judicial infrastructure of Am Yisrael, so that those types of non-Israelites, what we would call today non-Jews, right? Those types of non-Jews are the ones that we want to partner with in creating a better world, in creating a tomorrow. So if we really look at that Midrash and we look at these, typologies of the way that people respond to evil, and we also understand what our response to them is, based on the Midrash, we really get a sense of Am Yisrael's vision of how we view the outside world, right? The world of non-Israelites, right? The story of Bil'am is one in which, in the end, we have to eradicate Bil'am. He has to be killed because he is the one that is supporting evil and sowing further evil. And Iyov, we have really, we just look at him from the outside and we feel bad for him, but we don't really have anything more to do with him. Whereas Yitro, as I said, he becomes our partner for the future, and he is the image of that non-Jew who very much partners with Am Yisrael.
I think I'll just conclude by saying that the first Shabbat after Simchat Torah, the second Shabbat, we read about the flood story. And there were a lot of us that were using the narrative of the flood that we felt that very much was describing aptly our emotional space, right? Like one world had been destroyed. We're not exactly sure how it's going to be rebuilt, right? V'timaleh haaretz chamas, right? Obviously, there were all of these parallels to what we were experiencing. And I guess I'll just end with a tefillah, honestly, that when we read through these stories now of Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is a story of us becoming, or in our case right now, remembering very deeply that we are a nation that is bound together, fighting an evil, right? That, we live in a world we've sort of wanted to blur the lines between good and evil. And, the world has very much reminded us that is a highly dangerous endeavor to engage in the world. And there are things and elements and those who need to be taken out of this world. I guess I hope that we take this message of hope with us, that while we have to go through that process of getting rid of elements in the world that simply cannot be, if we want the world to be able to be sustained and become a better place, that will also find hope, and that will also find partners whom with we can continue creating this vision of a world that we want to be, partners both within us, and please God to continue finding partners that are also not only within Am Yisrael, because we can't sustain the world alone. We always need to find our partners. So I guess we'll end with that tefillah for today, Yael. Thank you so much for this conversation, sort of trying to understand the figure of Paro within the story, and as we've sort of really zoomed out in the world today. Thank you.
Thank you, Yosefa.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.